Thank you, Ivy, for that reading. That was really beautifully done. It's a story we've heard probably many times if you've been in church a while, the story of a man born blind. I thought I'd give you a little preview of my whole sermon. And the first slide, do I give a nod or a wink? Well, hopefully, in just a moment, there's my whole sermon. I took all the words in the sermon, put them there. If I just wait 15 minutes while you read it, can we call that a sermon? It's probably not a good offer for a preacher to make. It might get a yes. I'd like to take a few time jumps as we explore a few stories today. The stories I want to share with you take incredible... They show an incredible consistency in the love of God in human history across thousands of years. In the 19th century was a guy by the name of Horatio Spafford. That's a heck of a name, right? You might have thought I made that up as a perfect sounding name for that time. Horatio Spafford. Horatio was born in the late 1820s, so almost 200 years ago. He was a prominent lawyer, a senior partner in a large and thriving law firm in the United States, a member of his local Presbyterian church, and they were prominent abolitionists, close friends of supporters of that movement and of the renowned evangelist Dwight L. Moody. Horatio left the church today, those of us here today, with a beautiful legacy, and we'll get to that a little bit later in my sermon. But it's important that we know that despite all his worldly success, and Horatio was, to all intents and appearances, a very successful man, he and his wife Anna were well acquainted with grief, with tragedy, and with trauma. Horatio and Anna had 5 children. Their son died at age 2. Then they lost everything in the Great Fire of Chicago of 1871. In order to rebuild their lives, they decided to emigrate to Europe. And at the last minute, Horatio decided to stay behind to clear up some affairs with respect to the Great Fire that had happened. So he sent Anna and their 4 daughters ahead by ship. And while crossing the Atlantic Ocean, the ship that Anna and the 4 daughters were on collided with another ship and sank. And sadly, the 4 daughters perished. Anna, though saved, when finally on dry land, sent a telegram that is still saved in the Library of Congress, the American Library of Congress today, that says, "Saved alone, what shall I do?" All 5 children gone. Their home lost, their finances in tatters. Can we begin to imagine the depth of that grief? Sadly, their congregation at the time regarded their tragedy as divine punishment. For some kind of sin in their life, God must have visited this awful tragedy upon you. What a horrendous thought. What an even worse thing to say to someone experiencing unspeakable tragedy, especially by the people surrounding you as sisters and brothers in your community of faith. I mean, we understand the thought that comes, but don't we recognize it and say, away with that thought? What an awful thought. What an awful thing to say. But this community hadn't come very far from 1800 years earlier, from the story we heard today, where Jesus is walking with the disciples and comes across a man born blind. And the disciples' first question is, whose sin caused this? Whose fault is this? Who's to blame for this man's blindness? Is it his sin or his parents' sin? Only 2 options, apparently. In that 1800 years, that community of faith hadn't come very much further than the disciples' first reaction. And so we skip to the first century and explore a little bit more of what we hear Jesus saying to the disciples and interacting with this man born blind. Rabbi, who sinned, this man or his parents? Whose fault is this? In the Message version of the text that Ivy read this morning, when the disciples ask that question, whose fault is this? Jesus says, It's a loose translation in the Message, but it helps us to get a bit of a grip on what's happening here. Jesus says, you're asking the wrong question. You're looking for someone to blame. There is no cause and effect here. Look instead for what God can do. Jesus goes on to say to the disciples in the Message version, we need to be energetically at work for the one who sent me here, working while the sun shines. When night falls, the workday is over. But for as long as I am in the world, there is plenty of light. I am the world's light. Jesus says asking why and looking for cause and effect is looking in the wrong direction. Rather than focusing on what caused the tragedy to happen in order to assign blame, Jesus says it's time to get on with the work of making things better. This man, born blind, did not deserve this, and it's not about deserving or otherwise. And neither did Anna and Horatio deserve what happened to them. Nor do we, when we stop to think about the times of grief or tragedy or loss or misfortune we've experienced in our lives. It's very easy for superstitious thoughts to become religious thoughts. And Jesus is challenging at the very core that idea that somehow sin is the direct cause of tragedy and loss. The Message version continues, as he spits in the dust and made a clay paste with the saliva, he rubbed the paste on that blind man's eyes and said, go wash in the pool of Siloam. The man went and washed, and then he saw. Jesus gives an example of the kind of work that we're all called to participate in response to tragedy we see in the world. Asking why and whose fault, not the right way to spend our time and energy. Do something. Be a part of the overcoming of tragedy and setback. This is the kind of work you and I and the church are called to and have always been called to. People are not abstract concepts to be wondered about. They're sisters and brothers to be met, engaged with, helped. Jesus used a kind of bush medicine. I've never spat in the mud and put it on someone's eyes. I don't know if you have. But what we do know is that in this story, Jesus does something. He sends this man to wash in the pool of Siloam. And I think that must have some amazing water in it, that pool. It caused me to do a little bit of research. I wanted to know more about this pool. Is it special mineral water? Is it got some kind of sense about in the community this being an important pool? We have to go back from the 1st century now, as you can see up the top, to the 8th century. Right? So this is 800 years before Jesus, because this is when the pool of Siloam was first created. We read about this, and you can do some more research if you're interested, in 2 Kings and 2 Chronicles. And what happened was there is a number of rock-cut pools on the southern slope of the city of David. This was the original site of the city of Jerusalem. And the pools were fed by the waters of the Gihon spring, the reliable water source that made human settlement possible. And it was carried there by a tunnel, carried to the pools by a 500-metre tunnel. So almost 3,000 years ago, a 500-metre tunnel was built to bring a spring into a set of pools so that people could settle around it. We also read in 2 Kings and 2 Chronicles the story of Hezekiah, the king at the time, who was surrounded by assailants. He knew that his city and his people were about to be under attack. And so he changed the water course to no longer head down into the valley where it could feed those who were coming to attack the city, but to turn it back into the city so that it could be kept for the city itself. So the people coming to attack wouldn't be able to camp by the stream and replenish their strength and get ready for what was about to happen. So the Bible tells us that Hezekiah changed the course of this stream, built these rock-cut pools in order to save the people. So these pools have a sense in which they've always been intended to nourish and save and restore the people. So 800 years before Jesus, a king creates a tunnel and some pools and a way in which water can be saved and used for the people. Then 800 years later at Jesus, a blind man is made whole, is able to see again in these pools. But there's a connection here to the Spafford family, which still astounds me to this day. Back to the 18th century we go. So racked with grief, as you can imagine, spurned by their church family and separated, Horatio in America, Anna in Paris. Horatio sets off to be reunited. As he sails towards her, the captain of the ship alerts him that they are approaching the place where his children perished. Can you imagine what it means in that moment to be sitting on a ship knowing you are crossing the waters where 4 of your children have lost their life? Horatio returned to his cabin, leaned into his faith. He prayed. He experienced the same grace that was offered to the man born blind. A sense of release from his guilt, from his sense of responsibility, from his sense of this being a curse upon him and his life. He feels assured that God has not forsaken him. And he writes a hymn. He will be reunited with Anna shortly. They will go on to have 3 more children, 2 girls and a boy. Together they decide to move to Jerusalem, where they will set up an intentional community known as the American Colony in rented quarters just inside the Damascus Gate. They will take in orphans. They will serve the poor. People will call it a utopian society. They set up soup kitchens, hospitals, orphanages. They will serve Christian, Jew, and Muslim. And they will become renowned for their philanthropic work amongst the people of Jerusalem, regardless of their background, their religious affiliation. They decide to adopt a teenage boy, Jacob. Jacob was born in Ramallah into a Turkish Jewish family, but lost his parents. And here's what astonishes me. They adopt this teenage boy. Jacob is playing in the pool of Siloam one day and decides to crawl up into the tunnels and goes further, possibly, than anyone had been before. And Jacob discovers in 1880 what's now called as the Siloam inscription. It's an inscription that records the construction of Hezekiah's tunnel. It's been dated to the 8th century before Christ on the basis of the writing style and the carbon dating. It's the only known ancient inscription from Israel and Judah which commemorates a public construction work. These inscriptions were commonplace, but this is the only one that we have from that time. Essentially, Jacob finds the inscription that proves that what we read in the scriptures are true about what Hezekiah did and why he did it. I think it's amazing, all these connections between these 3 stories. The choices Hezekiah makes 800 years before Christ, the choice Jesus makes in response to a man born blind, and then the adopted son of a family who've lost everything, playing in that same tunnel, discovers the inscription that tells us that what happened 800 years before, as recorded in the Bible, is true. I think it's amazing that in this pool there are stories of the health and healing and wholeness that God intends for all creation, and that God's grace is a more powerful logic than the logic of cause and effect. Each of these moments remind us that God's story is a story of coming to us, of not somehow sitting back and judging us or casting things to happen to us based upon whether we're good or not, a cosmic Santa who judges whether we've been naughty or nice and then sends us things we deserve or otherwise. That instead, God has always been deeply invested in humanity, in God's people. Grace, if we come to the 21st century and ask ourselves what we think of such things here and today. There's a writer by the name of Anne Lamott, who I love deeply. She writes so beautifully. And she once said, "I do not understand the mystery of grace at all. Only that grace meets us where we are and does not leave us where it finds us." Grace meets us where we are but does not leave us where it finds us. This is an altogether different logic to whose sin caused this man to be blind, whose sin caused this family to experience unspeakable tragedy. It's a completely different logic. Grace meets us where we are, but does not leave us where it finds us. This is a beautiful, even though she says, "I do not understand the mystery of grace at all," a beautiful way to think about an alternative logic at work in the world in Christ. A man born blind is met where he is, but isn't left there. A family who have lost everything are met where they are, but are not left there. You and I, might we be able to testify to each other of the times where we have felt grace come to us, meet us where we are, but not leave us there, not leave us stuck, not leave us wallowing, not leave us bereft, but then instead God continues in Christ to come to us, to meet us where we are, and to take us somewhere forward, somewhere not stuck. Horatio died on October 16, 1888. He was buried in Mount Zion Cemetery in Jerusalem. And I said right back at the beginning that Horatio left a tremendous gift for the church that's still appreciated today, except for those who know what I was planning to talk about this morning. You can't answer this question. Anybody know what the gift Horatio left for the church is? Or Joy wants to... What is it, Joy? Yeah, he wrote a hymn, "It Is Well With My Soul." It's a beautiful hymn. It's a hymn based in deep lived experience of loss and tragedy, but of grace and of the possibility of being able to take a new step. And just as in Horatio and Anna's story, as they, rather than stay stuck in their grief, channel it into being of service to the poor, to the fatherless and the widow, as it were. So we are invited to see in the story of the blind man that chance where we get to be a part of being for each other. Instead of the community that judges one another and said, God must be mad at you, to remind each other God is not mad. God does not sit back causing this kind of trouble. God's intention for each of us is to be healed, is to be well. Some of us will experience that in all kinds of ways, and many times it will be in ways we don't quite understand or maybe didn't even expect. And yet still we come together to worship, to remind each other this is the God that we worship. One who reminds us that no matter what happens, no matter what we face, it is well with our souls. It is well with us because God's love for us from 3,000 years ago to now is still strong, is still personal, is still making lives whole.
When peace like a river attendeth my way, when sorrows like sea billows roll, whatever my lot, thou hast taught me to say, it is well with my soul. It is well with my soul. With my soul. It is well with my soul. No Satan should buffet the trial shofar. Let this blessed assurance control that Christ has regarded my helpless estate and has shed his own blood soul. It is well with my soul. It is well. It is well with my soul.